Hello, my name is Baker, and today I'm continuing my quest, my opinions on some of the bad critique in FF14. This one is gonna involve the take that there has been this kind of nostalgia baiting going on lately. As you can tell by my quotations and everything, I don't take this criticism too seriously, so that kind of answers the title/thumbnail. I'm sorry. But I figured it would still be interesting to find out where this sentiment comes from exactly.
Is anyone else sick to death of the nostalgia bait?
So this was like, I literally just did a quick Google search, you know, and this was like the first thing that came up. I mean, obviously, you know, this is Reddit, this is OF. We all know that the people, especially in the official forums, are quite miserable, so it's not very surprising to me that these people are going kind of ham on this, but yeah, you know, you can definitely see these opinions. I also have another image here. Someone is very upfront about the recent trial. I was also watching a video where the content creator heavily criticized the most recent trial, kind of just calling it, you know, really bad. That was basically poorly incorporated into F14. So where does this sentiment come from? I think it's just general being disappointed with the story, and then people latch onto these kinds of small things. I really do think so, because this has actually been a running complaint for basically as long as I have played the game. I remember in Stormblood, people had complaints about this exact same thing. In Shadowbringers, they had these complaints. In Endwalker, and now in Dawntrail, it's really nothing new. It's just that I think because of the poor reception of the MSQ, it's a bit more amplified. When we talk about Dawntrail, I want to address the elephant in the room first, which is the whole which this thumbnail was based off of, the Beatrix fight, or whatever the fuck she was even called in 14. I already forgot, like Zelenia or something. That, which kind of goes to show how forgettable that character is. That, in my opinion, it's not okay. The reference is nowhere near as bad as something like Nier. I won't be that hyperbolic to call it the worst reference, but it was pretty bad, I'm gonna admit that. I definitely see why there was a strong reaction after the 7.2 MSQ. I can understand it. I just think it's unfair to apply it retroactively to all of FF14 or even all of Dawntrail. But I will say, yeah, the way they just had that. I mean, it didn't even have much to do with the reference itself. The whole trial was just so poorly set up in general. But I think some people take that and say they didn't bother setting up the trial, so they're just banking on the whole nostalgia factor, which I don't think was the intention, to be honest. Yeah, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room. Well, so I guess the question then is, do you think the reception of Dawntrail, how much would you attribute it to the way the references were done? Do you think there is a nostalgia bait issue?
In Dawntrail?
Yes, specifically in Dawntrail.
I personally don't think so. Because, like, they don't do it like for example, Beatrix, even though it was, like, poorly executed, they still try to, like, make it seem original to some extent. Which, like, to me says, like, they're still trying to, like, be, like, graceful with the references, in my opinion. Even though it might not always work, I don't think it is so far has gone so far to say that it's like baiting, so to speak.
Well, I will point out that there was clearly a lot of effort put into the fight itself. It is clearly not just some random, you know, like, let's just toss this shit in there because we have nothing else to do.
So I would say, like, if there's anything that is, like, blatantly baiting, it is the Omega raid, if anything.
Or the Neo raid. Yeah, like, that brings us up an interesting point. Like, really, if we look back, right? Let me bring up the doc again on stream, actually. If we look back, right? We look at something like the Omega raid. Where's Omega? Right here. Look at something like this. Or this shit right here. Are we really gonna say that the references in Dawntrail are somehow worse than this shit you are seeing right here on your screen, ladies and gentlemen? Would you really say that? Like, can you tell me that with a straight face? You know?
I feel like people are a little bit overblowing, like, how much nostalgia baiting is doing. I mean, that's the general like point we're bringing up. But so there's like some references which are pretty like easy to pick up. Like for example, like Sphene is obviously meant to be like an allusion to Garnet. It seems like I've seen discussions where people seem to get like a bit more lost in this like idea where like everything almost has to be a reference. Where like I don't know if you've seen it, but I've seen people say like, oh, it's like Galuja is kind of like a reference to Vivi, and it's like I can kind of see it. Like they're both like these like childlike characters. Like there's like some backstory about like how they were created is a bit ambiguous and so on, and it's like maybe. But then like I saw like one example where it's like, oh, like maybe Vuklamat's meant to be an allegory to Zidane. It's like, okay, now at this point I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like
I remember one that was basically the 3 contestants are basically references to Mikoto, Kuja, and Zidane, and that kind of made me like, I don't know. I'm not. I'm not too sure about.
And it's like, so it's like it's like references like this where like maybe people are getting a bit ahead of themselves as well when it comes to nostalgia baiting. And
yeah,
He says he responded to what you said, Baker. He said that is valid. I think it is a factor, but I don't think it was the main hate of Dawntrail.
Oh, absolutely not. I will want to point this out, right? I'm not making this video as some kind of way to say like, oh look guys, you are hating on Dawntrail way too much. It's unfounded. No, I do still very much think there are very valid complaints about Dawntrail. I just don't think this particular one is something I agree with. So I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not trying to be like a contrarian here, like.
Yeah. And he follows up by saying that the way that Dawntrail's second half is just a reference is what irked me and took me out of the story completely. I also think this is why many people are so upset with it.
I personally disagree with the second half being just a reference. I didn't get those kinds of vibes though, but I could see it, to be fair. Like, it does have some, on the nose stuff. Especially in like when you go to the living memory and they literally do like the sword fight scene.
You can't like really compare like stuff that happens in this part of the story to FF9. Like there's not very much in common really at all.
Like it has some similar concepts, like obviously what the Terrans tried to do to Gaia in FF9 is a very direct parallel to Sphene trying to suck up all the souls. There's very similar concepts like parasitic planets, or I guess shard in this case, whatever. Trying to sustain off other planets. I kind of alluded at the beginning, but I think there's always gonna be these kinds of like similar inspirations. What are your concluding thoughts?
Oh, I don't think there is any. I don't think there's any nostalgia baiting per se.
So you think it's unfounded?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think the game is or should really ever try and be like, its fully original own thing. Like, it's part of this fucking 30-year-long running franchise at this point that, like, there's a lot of attachment to it. And, like, obviously, the devs like making these references and there's enough players that like these references that it's like a big draw for a lot of people.
That's funny because that's literally what I was like about to get into. And I have a few final things I want to bring up here. So the first one is the developer point of view, because I think it's good that we as players acknowledge what the developers themselves are doing. So there are 2 parts to this. First of all, the developers have very openly said the way they do references in this game. Like they've given a pretty clear explanation. The way they say they do it is they develop the story as normal, and then afterwards they will see if a reference will fit in here. So they might, for example, design an idea for an area and then see maybe some kind of iconic summon. Could be a boss fight here or something like that, right? That's my only example I used, by the way. I think some people kind of, especially when they become more negative towards the story, they start thinking that they actually do it backwards, the other way around. They think, oh, we can't make an impactful story, so now we have to add in some lame reference here as a substitute to have some like cheap shock factor. But what we've seen from what the developers have said, and you can even see if you actually look at the game and be honest with the way most references are done, you'll see that this is not the case. I think the developers are doing it exactly the right way. They first ensure it fits in the story and then they come up with the reference. Obviously, sometimes we can judge them, did they do the best job with it? Now, the second point I want to bring up here regarding understanding the developers a bit better is we also have to be real with ourselves and acknowledge that, you know, I don't know about you guys, but if I was in this position, let's say I was developing content for FF14 as a massive Final Fantasy fan, would I be inclined to add in references? The answer is hell yes. I mean, obviously, I've grown up with this series. I would love have these allusions, love letters, as Jin called it. I think that's very natural. And to be honest, like some of it is probably happens subconsciously even, you know. It's just kind of, you are naturally inspired, you know, by these past games. I mean, who doesn't get inspired by, you know, let's say you listen to one of Uematsu's songs from like the past games. How would that not inspire you as a musician, as an example? I think this is an element that maybe not a lot of people take into account, which is that it is completely normal to want to do these things. Again, keep in mind Final Fantasy is a very long running franchise. And we know for a fact, by the way, that many of the developers are huge fans of the series and have been playing them for a long time. Even some have even developed past Final Fantasy games like 12 and so on. Yeah, I just wanted to bring this up. I think it's good to take into account.
I mean, with something you said about working on past games, I mean, like, shit, you look at like the Evilly story, like it was written by the same person. Like it was.
Yeah, they literally brought Matsuno on board. I mean, and this is actually a good point. I remember watching this interview that Yoshida had with Matsuno, and you can tell like Mr. Yoshida had so much respect. You know, he was basically fangirling at Matsuno. And I mean, who wouldn't be? I mean, I love the man too. I think Matsuno is a legend. It's very humane. I kind of had a thought about this, and I think the easiest way I could phrase this was basically that just because something is a reference doesn't necessarily... It's not an indication of whether it's of poor quality nor good quality, I guess. You know, it really has to be usually examined on a case-by-case basis.
If Final Fantasy as a whole has so many archetypes, right? That if anything, I actually expect there to be a reference or an homage in some aspect. When I'm playing a Final Fantasy game, like I look forward to seeing Ifrit, for example, and then I hope to God that he's not a car like he is in 13.
Well, but
like...
instead we get a soccer player Ifrit in FF14 and a lizard.
I actually look forward to the references. Like I feel like it's an expected thing of Final Fantasy as a whole, and not just the obvious ones like Alomel, there's a summon, the more subtle ones. Some, for example, like just personality types. Like for example, the fact that Istinian is supposed to be obviously like kind of in the beginning, the first time you meet him, he's kind of like Cain, right?
Yep.
I like that shit. I think it's cool. Those are my favorite references whenever I see someone like the personality is supposed to be like a certain character.
I agree. Yeah, I think the references add so much. I guess that's a good way to conclude this actually. So let's wrap this up a bit here. Ultimately, for me, the references add so much joy and enjoyment to FF14. The whole theme park element I mentioned at the beginning, I really wouldn't have it any other way. And you know, sometimes we get references that maybe don't work as well. Nothing's perfect, right? But I don't mind there being one less desirable reference whenever there's, you know, 50 really good ones. So that's ultimately what I would say. They are 95% a net positive, maybe like 5% negative when they take it too far. But just because they sometimes take it too far doesn't mean that, you know, we have to, what's the English expression, like throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know?
The good references add more than the bad references take. So,
yep.
Sorry, not bad references, the clumsy references, I think is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, clumsy, yeah. I like that, yeah. Gotta soften the blow a bit.
I don't think really like anything that, you know, is done purely of, like I said, like, I mean, obviously the word nostalgia bait is very inflammatory. I don't think anything would like be like, oh, we're doing this purely just so people would be like, look, it's the old thing.
I do have an issue with the term nostalgia bait. Well, first of all, it's a negative connotation to something that shouldn't be seen as a negative thing, in my opinion. But secondly, to say that you got nostalgia baited implies some sort of deception on the part of the developers, right? Like the developers somehow tricked you, which I think is just asinine to say that was the case. I don't think the developers are trying to deceive the players. So luckily, the nostalgia bait is not a very common term.
I personally don't think it's like very well founded to use that term around Final Fantasy games.
I mean, it's kind of a losing battle to argue semantics on the internet anyway, I think. So like ultimately I think the point is, yeah, it's not nostalgia bait, it's fan service. And I don't think that term is a negative thing, like most of the time.
And I think Remy make a good point at the end here by saying that the poor quality also affects the way you view the references. I think that's ultimately we kind of spoke about this earlier as well. I think that's ultimately what's going on with Dawntrail. It's just the poor MSQ making people more upset about the references. But in reality, as we kind of had a look at with the Google Doc, we really saw that the way they've done references has barely changed over the past decade. But anyway, it's been a fun time, fun stream. Thanks for the chat, and have a nice day.